The most famous scenes in Spellbound are probably the dream scenes that Salvador Dali designed. They're very decorative, and for anyone who was half awake at the time that the film was being made, they're very identifiably Salvador Dali.
Salvador Dali is probably the most interesting and chameleon artist of the 20th century. There are certainly bigger artists such as Pablo Picasso. They're certainly perhaps more politically engaged. But I think what is really interesting about Salvador Dali is just to see the arc of his career.
Salvador Dali was born in 1904 in the Catalan town of Figueres, and he, from a very early age, wanted to be a painter.
Obviously a child prodigy, comes from a very, very comfortable background. The only thing he can do is paint.
His father was the town notary and was against this sort of an upbringing. He wanted his son to be a bureaucrat like himself, but Dali had this very artistic, creative bent. So his father eventually allowed him to go to art school in Madrid.
He meets there the flowering of Spanish culture. Garcia Lorca, Luis Buñuel, everybody who was important in Spanish culture was there, staying in the residencia. And Salvador Dali does incredibly well.
During that period, Dali became very, very interested in film. He was also doing paintings, obviously. He was against most of what was considered sort of the prevailing avant-garde in Catalonia.
However, this incredible flowering of culture also leads Dali into some very revolutionary ideas. And at the end of his university career, he decides that his professors are not apt to judge his art. But by that time, Salvador Dali already had a career, and it was an international career. He came up to Paris in 1929. Two very different things establish him, one of which is the film he made with Luis Buñuel, Un Chien Andalou, the Andalusian dog, and then his first one-man exhibition in a major surrealist gallery.
And one of the most famous images in Un Chien Andalou is a woman's eyeball being her eyelids being pulled apart and a razor going across her eyeball.
That became the sort of iconic surrealist picture. Surrealist when it wasn't actually intending to be surrealist, I suppose.
In Spellbound, it's kind of mirrored where you have the man with the giant scissors cutting the curtain that's painted with eyeballs.
These two things really found sort of Dali's position as a major artist, an artist involved in sort of obviously painting, but also one who is interested in other media such as film.
He was interested in double images, the way that one image morphs into another. Film really allowed for that. He was also interested in the ability of a close-up, where if you look at something very, very closely, it looks different than if you were to pan back. So that actually influences his painting later on.
Filmmakers were, of course, very interested in surrealism, well, at least Hitchcock, because dream is central to the theory of surrealism.
Surrealism was a desire to release individuals from social, religious, psychological constraints.
Surrealism was conceived as an international and multimedia think tank, even though it was literary at the beginning.
Dali was doing shows at the time and selling paintings, but really the surrealist interest in him initially was primarily for his work on Un Chien Andalou. Once he got in, he had an artistic style that was befitting the surrealist project as far as looking into the subconscious, but it was very different from what the rest of the surrealists were doing at the time. Most of the surrealists were trying to do automatic drawing, sort of scribbling something, and then they would look for the image inside there as a way to get their subconscious into an automatic work. Dali's mode was completely different than that. He wanted to paint his dreams because he felt his dreams were a reflection of the subconscious, but with very copious exactitude, that they were going to be very carefully done in sort of an old master's technique.
The importance of Dali's painting primarily has to do with his incorporation of a very, very hyper-realistic technical style to depict nightmares. And it's this sort of trick of the eye where Salvador Dali makes you believe things and your eye is saying, yes, that works, but your mind is saying, no, that cannot work.
This is what he had envisioned, and he didn't really have a ready explanation for it. He said that he didn't really understand what his painting meant at the time he was doing it. And so it would end up filled with various symbols and things that he would then kind of step back and try to interpret himself.
Interestingly, in the 1930s, it was Dali that founded surrealism, or came to embody surrealism in the United States.
One of the things Hitchcock used was a lot of sort of Freudian psychological imagery, and that's very prevalent in Spellbound.
Probably the Freudian theory that most influenced Dali was the Oedipus complex. Freud's theory that a son would overcome his father figure in order to attain the love of his mother. That was a really powerful psychosis for Dali, and he had a lot of sort of personal experience with that when his father kicked him out of the house in 1929, and so he did sort of feel as though he was rebelling against a sort of paternal authority, and he saw this parallel in the writings of Freud as well. This was significant in Spellbound because obviously the film is based on this idea that an Oedipal trauma can lead someone into a neurosis, forget about a murder, and it's very much built around this sort of Freudian plan. So Dali would have known very, very well what constituted an Oedipus complex when Hitchcock asked him about the film, when I'm sure he recognized it right away. Dali had a brother die before he was born. And of course in the film, it's very much about the main character killing his brother accidentally. So Dali would have been able to laden that with tremendous Freudian baggage. There are other interesting parallels that Dali would have been able to bring into Spellbound, probably if he'd had more artistic liberty.
When Freud met Dali in London in 1938, he wrote to the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig was the go-between between the two men. And Freud wrote to Stefan Zweig that he always considered surrealist people as, I quote, total lunatics. And he added, he might reconsider his position. After meeting Dali, he was very interested in this fanatic Spaniard, as he put it. And he said that it would be very interesting to analyze his painting.
Freudian analysis teaches us dreams bypass the usual sort of id controls, social constraints that we impose upon ourselves in our rational lives. Dreams are the ways where our subconscious breaks forward and tells us things that perhaps we don't want to think about. And the Surrealists were very, very interested in that because they saw that as a way of breaking through these social constraints. I think also that one of the interesting things about Surrealism, and especially about perhaps Dali's form of Surrealism, is to do with this idea of his idea of the paranoid critique, which is the idea that reality doesn't matter. It's how you perceive the world and how you want to interpret the world that's much more important.
This generation of people who literally, I think, discovered the mind. They discovered types of art, surrealism particularly, that were getting at the inner dreamlike states that we all know. And Dali was a painter of that world.
It was Hitchcock's idea to ask Dali to do the dream sequences. Selznick accused him of only doing it for publicity value, but Hitch liked the sort of sharpness of the images and the sense of eternity that he introduced into the images.
I think maybe first the basis of this has to be that Dali was a bankable name, and to attach his name to this film would give it extra cachet, would also increase the seriousness of the project, and would increase the publicity and ultimately the saleability of the film.
Whoever got the idea, it really wasn't a bad one. And it was another way for Hitchcock to talk about his film. We're using this famous Spanish artist, Salvador Dali, on our film. And wait till you see what we have that nobody else has. And so, in terms of promotion, and I'm sure Selznick was thinking about that, Dali was not a bad investment.